Stan was known for, he would make a deal on a handshake at a trade show or somewhere else. It may be not a big deal, but it reflected his approach to all deals, big and small. His mind was going 10,000 miles a minute, and the production ideas that he tried to pursue wasted a lot of energy, and some were not profitable at all. The television series, for example, was not a profitable idea at all. And I think that he wanted to be the person who would launch things, but he was not inclined to assure that there were people to adequately follow it through.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today we're picking up with our third episode relating to Stan Lee. Now, many of you may have watched one or both of the previous episodes in which Danny Fingeroth, the author of a wonderful biography regarding Stan Lee, name of the biography is A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. A Marvelous Life. Well, that's a great title, isn't it, Justin?
I couldn't be more perfect.
Danny was a wealth of information, and so I encourage you, if you've not seen those interviews, definitely look at them. We've done, to be honest with you, these combined, including today, are longer than was our intention. And ironically, this is about someone who I knew comparatively little about when I think of the other people that we've done episodes on. I find Stan Lee interesting. He's definitely extraordinary in many ways. Definitely an icon. So I think it was worthwhile that we've given a substantial amount of time to the discussion of his life, setting up the stage to talk about his estate planning, the last third of his life or so, and those very tangible things that are relevant to all of us, because there are universals when we talk about errors that are made in this. You may say, well, this is a rich person's problem. Not really. Some are rich people's problems, but a lot of this, the fundamentals are the same. If you look at the kernel of the dispute, yeah, there's more money involved, maybe there's a little more complexity, a few more entities, but often the error is very fundamental, and you'll see that in this case too. I'll start by talking about the estate plan that was in place. And Danny was helpful in illuminating some of these items that we'll make reference to today in this episode, which again is focusing on what conclusions can we reach regarding the life that we've discussed in the prior episodes. So Stan and his wife, they did have wills, they had trusts. They named the daughter, not surprisingly, as the sole beneficiary. You'd expect they had one daughter, JC. There was some concern toward, I think this was in 2016, a year before Joan's death, JC's mother, the wife of Stan. The year before Joan's death, which was in 2017, they decided that they needed to amend the trust, and the amendment apparently related to putting in spendthrift provisions. Spendthrift provisions are not just to protect the estate from a feckless child or prodigal child. It's also to insulate from attack from the outside, where you think that there will be people trolling to bring liability suits regarding anything from torts to breach of contract, et cetera. So that's another motivation, because a spendthrift trust, properly designed, will provide protection from the outside, as well as protections related to the judgment of the beneficiary. And in this case, apparently there was concern about JC. I don't want to be unfair to her, but it seems that she might not have had the best financial judgment. So there were amendments made. We don't know the details of this. Remember, this is a recurring theme in this whole series we've done, is that the nature of trust is such that you have privacy, and it's unusual to have the terms of trust publicly disclosed. It happens occasionally in litigation, but for the most part, we have to go on reports. It's reported. So I'll issue that disclaimer here as to some of the things that I'll say about the estate planning itself most directly. We don't know who the designated trustees were. We can speculate. And I read one report that said that JC was a trustee. The only way that I would believe that after the introduction of the spendthrift provisions would be if she had a co-trustee. Otherwise, it would be pointless to name a beneficiary that you're trying to protect from, say, abusing money, for example, or even from third parties. to go to the trouble to put those terms in the trust and then to make them a trustee is self-defeating unless you do it in the form of a co-trustee and you limit their authority, et cetera. So that might have been what happened here. But I think that the likely candidates that were named for trustees, again, I'm speculating, but these were people who did have substantial financial control and also played a large role in caregiving. I suspect that either the business manager, which we'll talk about, Jerry Olivares, I think is how you pronounce his name, and then there's a previous business manager that was there until close to the end, which is Kaya Morgan, and then Yuri Litvak, which is a former attorney. So it's not unusual to have an attorney named. So he probably was an attorney at the time that this was prepared, I suspect. In this case, we know that things didn't go well despite the fact that we know there was a estate plan, there was a will, there was a trust, there were spendthrift provisions, things that we would think, wow, these are the ingredients for success. This is a situation that illustrates very graphically the sort of truism that I was saying to you in the introduction to this, and that's that these things, these mistakes of which the great and mighty are subject, their fundamentals at least apply to all of us. And you may have in place a living trust, for example. It could be a beautifully drafted living trust. It could have a lot of wonderful features, all those protective measures that we might have suggested, and then you fail to people it, meaning to assign to the proper roles to the proper people, and it fails miserably. So in this case, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's important to have the right people in place. So we know that, to his credit, Stan and his wife Joan, they did have estate planning. Incidentally, Stan died, as commonly happens, a year after Joan died. So she died in 2017, Stan died in 2018. So there was a lot of litigation and controversy in the aftermath of their deaths and some preceding their deaths relating to accusations of fraud and mismanagement. So one was the business manager I'd already mentioned, Jerry Olivares. He was accused of exploiting, taking control of financial and legal affairs, transferring $4.6 million from Lee's account without authorization, and isolating him from family and friends. He was also given apparently a power of attorney. And, of course, a power of attorney, as we know, those of you who watch this show regularly, is a very, very powerful device. And it's a great weapon for good, and it's a great weapon for bad because it's so powerful. It's a blank check to a great extent. So he also apparently, there were numerous financial missteps. I guess by this, what they mean is just bad decisions. Apart from any fraudulent intent. I should make clear, these are allegations. There was a lawsuit. Apparently, Jerry Olivares settled the civil lawsuit, and we don't know exactly how much he paid. He settled the lawsuit before going to trial, or at least before the completion of trial. And then there was another candidate who had substantial authority, which was the predecessor of Jerry, also a business manager, Kaya Morgan. He faced charges including theft and embezzlement. But that went to trial, and the case ended in a mistrial, and it was not retried. So, there was no finding of guilt on the part of Kaya Morgan. And then Yuri Litvak, the former attorney, he was accused of financial exploitation, financial elder abuse, which we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's JC. She also was a player in this in that she probably was a co-trustee, but she certainly was in a position to where the assets, she had some access to them up until the death of her parents. Remember, the trust really kicks in at the death unless there's a declaration of incompetence. So since there was no formal hearing and this finding of incompetence, then Stan continued to be in charge largely of his estate, at least in formal terms. In substantive terms, I think clearly others were entirely in charge in that last year, and among them, I suspect, JC. Though there were accusations, as I just mentioned, relating to elder financial abuse, you should know that there was no criminal convictions. So it's not conclusive, as to whether or not, in fact, something like that happened. But in fairness to these people, there were any convictions related to the elder financial abuse. So here I want to make a statement that I think is applicable to the substantial majority of estates where things have gone wrong. And these are things that will, I think, sound very familiar to you, either to people you know outside your family or perhaps even in your family. And it's what I kind of call the perfect storm that's all too common among elderly. And what it seems almost like there's a conspiracy of events or circumstances that come together to create this incredible vulnerability and to, I think, give the opportunity for mischief that happens. And not just mischief. It can just be incompetence. But the point is, things go way awry of what the original intention was. And how is it that happened? And I'm suggesting to you that there are 4 key elements that are all too common in all these cases, and I suspect some that you can name. What are they? Number 1, progressively declining cognitive ability of we'll call them testate or the elderly person. And it can often be a husband and wife together, but as long as the wife is alive, and this is a little gender specific, because often the wife is the one who is in a better condition cognitively later on than the husband. But it's a generalization. Anyway, so whenever you have one of the spouses, though, that has the ability to monitor things well, then under those circumstances, you can have this guardian of the estate at least the point of death, and then thereafter, assuming the right decisions were made before, then things stay in place. But too often it doesn't go that way. It'll be where the one spouse will die, so you'll have one left, and then that spouse will decline. So at this point, you don't have anybody who is capable of taking the will within that household. One spouse is dead, the other is in cognitive decline, or both are alive and both in cognitive decline. That could be true too. So anyway, that's one of the elements that sets up this scenario. The other is where you have either the couple's childless, or more commonly, there's a child or children that are simply irresponsible or dishonest. It could be either one of those, meaning that they may just be prone to do selfish things, maybe dishonest things, but often it can be a really kind-hearted, well-intended kid who just doesn't have good judgment, so they're incompetent. So that's a reason I don't want to suggest that you always have devious children when this happens. Often that's not the case. Often it's a kid who's just irresponsible. Is the bottom line. So remember, factor 1 is declining cognitive ability. Another is that you have children who are simply irresponsible or dishonest. Now, 2 more elements. Another one is trusted advisors or caregivers who end up, for the reasons I just mentioned largely, with broad authority but little oversight. So you see how we're setting up a scenario that is virtually an invitation for things to go badly before the death of the estate planner, or when I say estate planner, I mean the person for whom the estate planning's done. And that can be holders of powers of attorney, not many guardrails on that. Access to online credit card accounts, unauthorized access as well. Caregivers who simply become familiar with what accounts and things are out there, so they're in a position to take liberties that they wouldn't otherwise be in a position to take. Joint tenants. By joint tenants, I simply mean people who have their bank accounts and somebody is named as a co-tenant on the bank account. Joint tenancy, it's called. And they're there not because they're intended to own half of it, but they're there for the convenience of the person, the elderly person. And this often goes badly. It's something I strongly dissuade clients from doing. So think about what we have here so far. We have progressively declining cognitive ability. So the aging person is just not what they used to be. So it's kind of like they're there now for the first time in their life. They're at the mercy of others in a way that they've never been, or at least not since they were a small child. So they're back to that in terms of their dependency. And it's progressive. It's usually not sudden. And then you either have no children to help, or more commonly you have a child or children who are inclined to do more harm than good, not necessarily because they're bad. And then you have, let's throw into the mix, this declining person will have somebody that they're going to look to help with their stuff. And this could be anybody. It could be an insurance agent at their church that they've come to trust and believe in. This person's, they like them. They see them singing with a hymn book every week. And so they say to themselves, this is a good, honest person. It could be a lawyer. It could be a financial planner. And who knows what that word means anymore. But financial planner means somebody who probably sells financial products. But in any case, they're in every religious organization, every church, every synagogue across the country, and too often they're given a presumption of trust that they may not be deserving of, and that may ultimately produce an exploitive situation. So I'm not picking on people that meet their financial advisors in church or synagogue. I'm just saying that often the people that end up in this role, what becomes a self-interested advisor / caregiver, are people that were not adequately vetted. They were not people who got to where they are by virtue of an objective, dispassionate application process. And if you think about it, that's really the way you should hire somebody for such a key pivotal role. I mean, think about how much trouble you go with if you have a housekeeper. Some of you won't identify with this, others will. But if you've interviewed somebody like a housekeeper or a groundskeeper or somebody who is managing your real estate, you probably went through a series of interviews. You scrutinized closely their CV, whatever it was, the resume, and so you did the things that you think to yourself, gee, I need to be sure this is the right person. And if you're an employer, think of the people that you scrutinize their resumes, et cetera, and these are people for relatively minor roles in your organization, unskilled roles in your organization, and contrast that with the most skilled role in your life, which is this small circle of advisors that you have that will make decisions of a legal nature, a financial nature, a health nature. My impression, my experience has been that these people are not selected on the basis that they should be, given the gravity of the matter that's going to be placed in their hands. So the third item we have here, self-interested advisors, caregivers. The final item does separate this category of circumstances from many, and this fourth item assumes that there's a state of sufficient size to where abuse or misconduct can go undiagnosed for a substantial period of time. In other words, it does assume somebody has a sufficiently large estate to where when these people, take liberties with credit cards, take liberties with online banking accounts, and other things that they do. These are things that typically occur when you have an estate of significant size. And by significant, I'm not talking about 100 million. I'm talking about maybe 1 million. I would doubtlessly include many of you watching this show. It's enough to where what makes this so insidious is that this misbehavior goes on for years, and it's like there's no one to police it. It's really a extraordinary situation that you have somebody who, in contrast to when they were a child, they were totally dependent, but there was not this estate of things they had accumulated over the course of their life. They came into this world naked and crying, and so the last time they were in this position, it was just them physically. That was the extent of their needs. But here we are 80 years later, 90 years later, and a person is progressing to a similar state. I don't want to make this, this metaphor only goes so far. But it is a way to view this. And so you have them coming to a state where they can't control their stuff anymore, but except now they accumulated a lot of stuff. I mean, they were extraordinary in many ways. In their own way, they were extraordinary. And they succeeded, and when so many people fail. So they have 1 million, 3 million, 5 million, whatever the number is, they have this thing, this estate that they've accumulated through a whole lot of work. I mean, thousands and thousands of hours, if you think about over a lifetime. If you ever sit down and think how much time you spend trying to take care of your assets, to manage your liabilities, which implicates your career, your business, everything else. So here you have a situation toward the end at arguably the peak of the estate for many people. Some people start winding down their estate. A lot of people, their estate, though their intentions were to wind it down, it continues to grow because they underspend when they get old. That's another show. But anyway, so these people, at this point where they have maximum value in their estate, it's when suddenly, not suddenly, but progressively and dramatically, they find that they can't run their life or their affairs anymore. Now, it may not be completely true, but the diminution has a dramatic effect. So let's assume that it's not somebody who becomes vegetative, of course. It's not somebody who has to be in a home, for example, meaning in a skilled care facility. It could be somebody who is functional on some level, but the ability to make the decisions that they made at one time is just not there. So oddly enough, tragically in many cases, that produces this expanse of opportunity for the people around them, and opportunities that wouldn't exist for those people for that person 20 years ago. The final element is therefore that you have an estate of sufficient size to where you do have, number one, it invites the participation of these self-interested advisors, professionals, caregivers, however you want to categorize them. It invites their participation, and it also allows them to engage in misconduct that in some cases I'm sure is never diagnosed. In other words, sometimes there's no one around to do a sort of investigation or an autopsy, not literally, but an autopsy on their estate to identify the fact that you have things that are missing and transactions that are questionable and purchases made, et cetera. Often there's just no one inclined to do that, especially if one of those people is named as the executor, which is commonly what happens. So when I tell you about this perfect storm, often characterizes people's latter years as well as their death, and not just their death, but their latter years. Matter of fact, most of the mischief occurs in those latter years more so than after death. But both are notoriously vulnerable, and they're vulnerable because you don't have the person most interested often involved. And depending on who the beneficiary is of your trust, you may have beneficiaries who could be children. They could be adults who are just disengaged. Could be adults who completely lack sophistication and have a great measure of trust for these people. These are often people they know. It could be a family member. It could be the attorney that they've come to know over many years. It could be the insurance agent they've come to know over many years. They've seen you sitting in the living room, with mom and dad over the years, and so they think that you're like an uncle to them. So that's what I call a perfect storm. Again, declining cognitive ability, either no children or children that are dishonest or irresponsible, and then the self-interested advisors, caregivers, and then finally an estate of significant size. So these factors were at work here in this case. This is just an example of how this works. There was decline in the later years. Joan was clearly more of a watchdog over the affairs of Stan than, she was apparently by all accounts, and Danny, the biographer, was telling us that she kind of policed the borders in terms of, where was the money going? Why was it going there? Are there banks properly handling their money? She really she was on top of things as every couple needs somebody like that. And often it's not the promoter. It's often not the person who's the blow and go deal maker. It's often that person who has more of a bookkeeper's mentality. And the two of them are a marvelous team. And I think that to a great extent, Stan had that. I think Joan could not control Stan as much as I wish she could have, but they were a powerful team in large part for that reason. So she dies in 17, and then Stan was a little adrift, but a lot of the damage had been done even during that period of time because, in fairness, Joan too was in decline. So we don't know, we'll never know exactly what truth there are in all these allegations. Some money was recovered from the one advisor. But I think the lesson for us here is that when you create a great plan, you've got to populate it or people it with solid, professional, honest, and hopefully insured professionals. So that means that if the estate's of any significant size at all, you should really consider having as a co-trustee some sort of institution. It could be a bank. Brokerage firms sometimes do that. It means they're insured. It means they have lawyers telling these people how to run the organization, so it's professionalized in a way that when Uncle Will is running it, for example, it's not. You still can have a personal touch in many of these organizations. A lot of the bank trust departments are very personalized, and they try to give the sort of care and attention that maybe a family member would have. So I think that if you vet your attorneys, you vet anybody who is given any authority in your estate plan or the latter stages of your life has to be thoroughly vetted. And I would argue that you want them to be insured. This means that the positions we're talking about here are whoever you choose for your trustee. I mean, you create a wonderful trust, we'll assume. Let's take that for granted that your terms are good on your trust. It's a different show to talk about what those should be. But then when you decide who's going to be in charge of running your trust, you need to be very thoughtful in that decision, and you need to name successors. And again, institutional trustees are great to bolster whatever individuals you choose. And with a division, you can do a division of authority, certain areas that they're each responsible for. The power of attorney, of course, same thing, same criteria. There's nothing wrong if you have some discomfort with any individual to have two people. It's harder to put together a crime with two people, and it's even harder to put together with three people. I mean, conspiracies are less common than individual crimes because that cooperation reduces the probability that those things occur. No guarantees, of course, but I just think that Stan was probably a trusting guy in many ways. And I think that Stan was inclined to go with who he had for a period of time. And I think his attention to detail, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, was not what it should be. But I think that is characteristic of such people. All in all, I would say it was a great plan, and it failed because probably the people involved. And the failure started before Stan and Joan died. And it unfortunately continued thereafter by all accounts. One thing I want to mention before I move on from this part of the discussion is there is a statute in virtually every state relating to what's called elder financial abuse. So I looked at the provisions for the California statute, which I think is a uniform statute, so it's probably going to be very similar to what exists in your state. I just want you to know that this law exists because it can be powerful. It was used in this case. There wasn't enough for a conviction, but it may have inspired one of the settlements. So it's great for all the reasons I mentioned. I mentioned to you about this perfect storm. Well, this is as perfect a response to that as you can have. I mean, it's up to each family to fashion their own solutions in the way that I just suggested. But in terms of what the state can do, this is about as good as it gets. I think it's a great statute. So elder financial abuse. It is misuse of power of attorney. It includes that element. I'm going to list each of these elements. Abusers exploit their legal authority to access and misuse an elder's finances. So any misuse of a power of attorney falls under elder financial abuse. Scams and fraud. This includes identity theft, lottery scams, telemarketing fraud, anything that targeted an older adult in terms of these scams that we all are so familiar with today. Coercion and manipulation. And this is where perpetrators use emotional pressure or threats to gain control over an elder's assets. I think this contemplates somebody in a nursing home, for example, where maybe an employee of the nursing home, or it could be a family member, but somebody who implicitly threatens somebody, the older person, into complying with their wishes. Because the older person's vulnerability, they may need this person for their care, for their food, for their lives. Unauthorized transactions. This involves unauthorized use of credit cards or bank accounts by trusted individuals. Finally, exploitation by family members, which includes relatives may feel entitled to the elder's assets, leading to theft or coercion. So this hits on clearly the most common circumstances under which this occurs. This is a marvelous development. Many people don't know about elder financial abuse, but it's in the criminal statutes. It's not a civil matter, it's a criminal matter. And depending on the magnitude, it can be a felony. And I don't know, those limits will vary from state to state. Let me mention one other thing that some of you will have seen the episode we did with Travis Campbell, who's the son of Glenn Campbell. Glenn was, I want to be fair to his widow. He was isolated to some extent, or at least he didn't have a lot of contact with some of his children, particularly the children from the first marriage, of which there were 3 children from that marriage, and one of them was Travis. So Travis, who wanted to see his dad and he argued was deprived access, and he felt that was in part for financial reasons. I mean, often you remember the method here in which this sort of exploitation occurs often involves keeping the elderly person separate so that they can't really be discovered. And again, I'm not accusing Glenn Campbell's widow of this, but I'm just saying that Travis made these allegations, and he joined with the children of some other celebrities, and they testified before the state legislature of Tennessee, arguing that there should be a law that assures family members access when a step-parent or another family member is denying these family members access. And I think this happens a lot. So I thought it was a marvelous work that Travis did and those that joined him. And they did get this legislation passed. So I don't know if it was added to, it's probably under the elder abuse section, but I don't think it wasn't categorized as just a financial abuse. It was access generally and all the implications that might have that are unfavorable for the elderly person.
Real quick, I was going to mention, too, there's a lot of good information in some of our previous Better Business Bureau episodes that relate to this as well.
Good you mentioned that.
So if our viewers want to check out those Better Business Bureau episodes.
Yeah, good idea. So I want to talk quickly, though, about Stan's life leading up to this, and I think I can do this in about 10 minutes. Some of the characteristics that I described a few moments ago when I talked about the latter third or so of his life, I think that to a great extent those characteristics in some form existed maybe throughout his life. And it's almost a stereotype of people who have a sort of promoter personality. And often they're creative types, but they're people who have a certain set of characteristics that are wonderful. Matter of fact, it's a gift. It's a gift that by which they often become very successful. But along the road to that success, it's not uncommon for them to make mistakes and to maybe end up with far less than they should have had they been more careful along the way. So let me first make a few comments, and this is not necessarily in chronological order, though I'll try to keep it in that way. So the Marvel comic years, so 1945 to 98 were those years, as we talked about at length. And we know that Stan and others, but Stan played a large role in the creation of these characters, particularly in the years 1962, 63 or so. I mean, it's virtually a revolution where he reconceived the role of these characters. And it's part of the reason that Stan Lee's an icon. Spider-Man, Black Panther, Iron Man. But as we mentioned in the show, and I want to revisit, Stan did not probably didn't have the bargaining power to demand any sort of copyright credit for these characters. Instead, he was an employee, work for hire it's called, and as a result, whatever you produce under those circumstances doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your employer. So we discussed this at length, but I wanted to bring it back to say, could Stan have managed this stage of his career differently? Well, we don't know. I think that he probably had more clout than he thought. And he did, we know, ultimately negotiate a contract by which he was to get 10% of any of the money that flowed from these characters through broadcast or video production, movie production. And that ultimately there was a lawsuit and he was vindicated. The court ruled in favor that he did have this contract. So it wasn't the same as having an ownership interest, but to his credit, he did negotiate this deal, and it was held up, and he got a payment of $10 million, and he ended up getting, not necessarily as part of this deal, but he ended up with $1 million a year salary as a sort of promoter for POW, P-O-W, Power Entertainment, which is the second entity he had formed after leaving Marvel. So in this case, it's not so much a criticism, but I just think that Stan later regretted, I know he did, he's discussed this in interviews, where he didn't assert earlier these claims, and maybe he would have gone out on his own. Maybe he would have gotten concessions from Marvel management, which we know was a family member. We don't know that, but I think during that year of his greatest productivity, I think he was underpaid given what we know now. And could he have been more entrepreneurial in those early years? Maybe. Post-Marvel years, Stan tended to enter ventures without a great deal of premeditation. He left Marvel in 98. So in 99, there was Stan Lee Media, Inc. This was led to a lot of litigation, led for filing a bankruptcy. There's disputes over what assets he had transferred. And again, this is the Stan. This is his nature, in my opinion. He doesn't document well, and he does deals that later there's a lot of dispute about what those deals were intended to be. And then with POW Entertainment, he ultimately obtained control over POW Entertainment. I think that Stan started out, he and his wife, with 45% of the entity. That was eventually diluted down to 5%, but that was in efforts to raise money to make the company more successful. There was a lot of disagreement about what it was exactly that Stan conveyed to POW. There was litigation that went on for years, a decade, in which Stan vehemently opposed the idea that he had transferred to this entity virtually all claims to name, likeness, signature, all those things that you think that he would want to hang on to himself, because he did own that. Maybe he didn't own the copyright to these characters, but he owned himself, and himself had a brand, and it had great value, we know. So the idea that he would have transferred all of that to POW Entertainment, it doesn't seem reasonable to me without a ton of payment. And he definitely didn't get a ton of payment because we know where he ended up. So my thought is that this was a deal where there was more verbal than there was written, that there may not have been attorneys adequately involved, at least on Stan's side of the table. And I think that there was just a haste to move forward. And I think this often characterized Stan's approach to things is let's just move forward. We'll figure it out. So that ended up costing him a lot. I mean, he lost that. So his estate didn't have the benefit of that. It continued to be litigated, incidentally, after his death. J.C. brought another action. First Stan dismissed his last action, actually the year when he was still alive, but when he died in 18, he dismissed. And then J.C. refiled the suit and went on fighting it, J.C.'s his daughter, for a couple years. And finally a court, and this must have been on the tail end of a series of courts that had ruled against her. I didn't pull the court file, so I don't know that long litigation, but I know it was lengthy. And so irritated was the judge that when he dismissed it, he sanctioned her, the plaintiff, for $1 million, so I've read, $1 million. And that's unusual for the person who brings the case to be ordered to pay essentially the attorney fees. And I think that's what it was, $1 million in attorney fees to the other side. But the court was saying, look, this was not a meritorious claim. And so you've been bringing a frivolous claim, and so we're going to sanction you. That's generally the case. Again, I don't know. I didn't read this file, but that's generally what underlies a decision to sanction someone in order for them to pay the other side's fees. So it looks, in other words, like Stan did transfer this stuff. This is not inconsistent with my experience in life as a business person with people like this, often very talented, great promoters. They have all these wonderful assets, but they need around them the right people to assure that the T's get crossed and the I's get dotted. So here are my closing comments when I look at Stan's life from a financial standpoint, not in terms of his wonderful creative genius. These experiences, coupled with what we learned from Danny, his biographer, they reflect this common phenomenon, which seems to have these characteristics. Now, this is for very talented and successful people, often in creative fields. So these people often are successful, and we can look at it, actors and other creative people, but yet they don't end up in a very good position financially often. So here's what I think I often see. Number one, they're notoriously inattentive to the details of their deals. They want to get the deal done, and they think maybe they're clear on it, but they're just inattentive to these details. It's not the way their brain works. And number two, they are prone to enter into ventures without adequate planning or forethought. So sometimes a business idea may seem great when you first start thinking about it, but the more you sit down and put pencil to paper and start walking through projected earnings and revenues and expenses, et cetera, then you often will conclude that doesn't make sense. But it's important that great ideas be followed by great attention and consideration before they're pursued. And I can, certainly with the first business, that was the case. It wasn't viable from the outset without going into that. We talked about some of this. Look at our previous 2 episodes. And another characteristic, they're disinclined to adequately monitor the business side of their projects and their enterprises. I think that Stan had in place people that he said, you take care of this. And it's true, if he had chosen the right people, that's a business model that does work. So, as a matter of fact, it's my answer to people who have this personality is that you have to have these people, and you do assign them the responsibility to adequately monitor and manage. There wasn't the adequate monitoring and managing for several of these businesses, and as a result, millions was wasted in litigation, among other things. So, and then finally, the factor I'd mentioned, they often don't include appropriate professionals, or they fail to follow their advice. So it's coming from a lawyer. Stan was known for, he would make a deal on a handshake at a trade show or somewhere else. It may be not a big deal, but it reflected his approach to all deals, big and small. And his mind was going 10,000 miles a minute, and the production ideas that he tried to pursue wasted a lot of energy, and some were not profitable at all. The television series, for example, was not a profitable idea at all. And I think that he just he wanted to be the person who would launch things, but he was not inclined to assure that there were people to adequately follow it through. Didn't have to be him, but it had to be somebody. It's often said that there are 2 types of people in the world. There are people who start projects, and there are people who finish projects. And both are important. I mean, the conception people, the people with the grand ideas, the best stuff that in the world probably came from those people, but a good portion of those people were not the people who completed those, nor were they inclined to, nor could they. It's a good balance to have around somebody who's a great generator of ideas, a great starter of projects, endeavors and visions and whatnot, that there be somebody on the other side of that to assure that it's walked through properly. And I think that he didn't have that in the latter stages of his life for sure. So anyway, these are my comments. Stan Lee, wonderful, incredible guy. I'm glad that I learned as much as I have about him, and I've come to respect him. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it beneficial as well. My name's Joe Cordell. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.